Hi everyone, for this tutorial I'll be showing you how to work up buttonholes when working the ribbing of your crochet cardigan. Buttonholes are worked at the same time as when you are working ribbings along the front opening of your cardigan. The first thing to think about is the side that you are going to work these buttonholes. Generally, buttonholes are worked on the right side of the cardigan. That's on the front of the cardigan. So it's the side that sits on the right when the cardigan is on your body, as opposed to what you are seeing here in front of you, which is the opposite. I've placed these stitch markers showing you where I'd like my buttonholes, and on the opposite side I'll go ahead and place buttons. Now what you see here is the buttonholes on the left and the buttons on the right. But once I fit on this cardigan, the buttonholes will be on my right and the buttons will be on my left, which is the opposite of what you're seeing right here in front of you. Once you've gotten the side, the correct side that you are working these buttonholes on, we'll go ahead and get the placement of the actual buttonholes. So I've already marked off the placement of these buttonholes using these stitch markers. When marking off the placement of the buttonholes, use a measuring tape. That way you get an equal distance between your buttonholes. You may also use the stitch pattern as a guide for the placement of your buttonholes. When marking off your buttonholes, work from the bottom of the cardigan going up. That way you are able to leave a portion of the upper cardigan unmarked. This portion forms the neckline of your cardigan. Just to give you an idea of the measurement for the portion of neckline that I left unmarked, that measurement is around 10 inches. Or if you work in centimeters, that's around 25 centimeters. This measurement is optional. You decide depending on the length of your neckline. You can go further up on the neckline or you can go lower down on that neckline. We'll now work the ribbing along this front opening. Now, as I work the ribbing, you will see that the concept of a buttonhole is always the same. So it doesn't really matter what stitch you're using. It could be a single crochet, a half double crochet, double crochet, front post double crochet, or back post double crochet. The concept is always the same. It's always going to be a chain one, skip one, and that forms a hole in the stitch pattern. So that's the actual buttonhole. Here I am attaching yarn to the bottom edge, getting ready to work the ribbing. For this ribbing, I'll be using single crochets, but as I explained, the stitch doesn't really matter. It's just the concept of the chain one, skip one to form the buttonhole itself. I'm working with a chain 7 for my ribbing. Row 1 into the second chain from the hook, single crochet. Continue with single crochets into the remaining chains. Always check your stitch count when working ribbings. Make certain that your stitch count remains the same. In this case, it's 6 stitches. Now take note that I am in line with my first stitch marker that marks off the buttonhole. I'll continue on working 2 slip stitches to join the ribbing to the edge of the cardigan, and here I am in line with the stitch marker. Then it's turn, Skip the 2 slip stitches and continue on with the ribbing, working single crochets into the back loops only. Here I'm going to work the buttonhole along the center of my ribbing. So counting from the top edge, I'll work my buttonhole into the 4th stitch. Let's look at that again, counting from the top. Here's my stitches. That's 1, 2, 3, and 4. I will work my buttonhole into that 4th stitch. So it's a chain 1. When you get to that 4th stitch, you can chain 1 as I've done, skip that 4th stitch and work a single crochet into the next stitch. That way you formed a hole in the stitch pattern, and that's your buttonhole. At this point, you can make certain that your button that you've chosen can actually fit into that buttonhole. If it is a large button, you might want to go with a chain 2, skip 2 for a much bigger button. I always suggest purchasing your buttons after you've worked the buttonholes. That way you can always fit your buttons into those buttonholes. Preferably don't go for a much smaller button. That way your button is less likely to fit that buttonhole. You'd find that your button comes undone all the time. Just to give you an idea here, for a chain 1, skip 1 on single crochets, the button I used was 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters. Continuing on, I'll work those single crochets into the back loops only to complete the ribbing. Make certain that the number of stitches remains the same. For our next round, it's chain 1, turn, single crochets into your stitches, working those single crochets into the back loops only. Your stitch count must remain the same throughout the ribbing. Now we're joining the ribbing to the bottom edge of the front opening of this cardigan. So it's 2 slip stitches into those next 2 stitches. Then it's turn, skip your slip stitches, continue on with single crochets into the back loops only to complete this row for your ribbing. For the next row, it's chain 1, turn, work single crochets into the back loops only to complete this row. Now you'll see that as I'm working, all I'm doing is repeating rows 2 and row 3 of the ribbing, with working those single crochets into the back loops only. The only time I will really change is once I get my ribbing in line with those stitch markers. When they are in line with those stitch markers, those are my markers letting me know that it's time to work a buttonhole. At this point, as I'm working this row, I fall into line with the next stitch marker. That's an indication that I need to work a buttonhole in the next row. So here I am working those 2 slip stitches. Notice I am in line with the stitch marker. Turn, skip those 2 slip stitches. And then I'll find that 4th stitch again, counting from the top edge of my ribbing. So here's my 4th stitch. So I'll work my way to that stitch, and then it's going to be a chain 1, skip that 4th stitch, and continue on with single crochets into the remaining stitches. Now in this particular case, I'm using the 4th stitch to work my buttonholes. It does not need be the same for yourself. You may decide which stitch you'd prefer using for your buttonholes. It could be the 5th stitch or the 6th stitch, depending on how wide your ribbing is. Oops, sorry, here my stitch marker came undone. I'm just using my stitch pattern to mark off the next buttonhole. Anyways, continuing on. You may use your 5th or your 6th stitch depending on how wide your ribbing is. It doesn't really matter. I just chose to go with the 4th stitch here. That kept my button right in the center of my ribbing, which is what I was looking for. Also, counting from the top edge of your ribbing is optional. By that I mean when I'm counting for that stitch to work my buttonhole. You may also count from the bottom edge, just as long as that stitch that you selected for your buttonhole remains the same throughout the ribbing for all your buttonholes. In my case, I used the 4th stitch and I counted from the outer edge or the top edge of my ribbing, and I made certain that whenever I worked the buttonholes, that's the way I always counted. I looked for my stitch. I would count from the top edge, and it was always a chain 1, skip 1 into that 4th stitch. That way you know that your buttonholes are going to be along a straight line along that front ribbing. In the time that I've been talking, I have managed to get in line with my next stitch marker. Now I'll work slip stitches into the next 2 stitches to join my ribbing to the edge of my cardigan. And then for the next row, it's turn, skip those 2 slip stitches, work single crochets into the back loops only, setting aside that 4th stitch to work the buttonhole. So then at that 4th stitch, it's a chain 1, skip the 4th stitch, continue on with single crochets into the back loops only. So here I formed my buttonhole. Now I'm going to undo this buttonhole just to give you an idea of how to work a much bigger buttonhole. Here we'll be skipping 2 and chaining 2. So here's my chain 2, and I'm working it into the 4th and the 5th stitch. So I've skipped the 4th and the 5th stitch, and that gives me a much bigger buttonhole. But do be careful when working bigger buttonholes. Rather make certain that your button is able to fit into that buttonhole first. Also, do keep in mind the stitch that you are using for your ribbings. Using a half double crochet or a double crochet and skipping 2 of those stitches will give you a much bigger buttonhole. I would rather just skip 1, chain 1 when working with half double crochets or double crochets, because those stitches are much longer, so you'll end up with a much bigger buttonhole. So now I'll continue on with my ribbings. You may use this method for whichever pattern you're working on and you feel that you'd like buttonholes. It's just that keep in mind the stitch that you're working with. As I said, the concept is the same. It's just chain 1, skip 1 for your buttonholes. And I think that one of the most important things is that button that you choose must be able to fit through the buttonhole. I'm not afraid about it being too tight. I'd prefer it being too tight rather than it being too loose and coming undone. Now that I've shown you the buttonhole portion of this video, I'm going to continue on to complete my ribbing around the front opening of this cardigan. And here it is, the completed ribbing. I've only worked the chain 1, skip 1s for the buttonhole portion of my ribbing, and thereafter I just continued on with my ribbing without any chain 1, skip 1s. Now to fix those buttons onto my cardigan, make certain that when you get them on, you do align them well with your buttonholes. I'm using sewing needle and thread, so this is just a plain cotton thread that I'll be using to stitch on my buttons onto my cardigan, onto the ribbing portion of my cardigan on the opposite side, and making certain that it is in line with those buttonholes. So that does it for this tutorial. I hope that it was helpful and that you have enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.